Okay, brilliant. Good afternoon for colleagues and students from Oxford, and good morning to our speaker and audience from US. I'm Shidong Wang, the director of Oxford Process and Global Development Institute, which is pretty long, called OPDDI, at Oxford University Regent Park College. Welcome all of you joining today's talk. From the screen, I can actually see from a list quite many familiar names for today. So thank you for joining. So I understand this is Friday. Everybody probably want to, thinking of finishing this week. As this term in Oxford, we are kind of returning, quite fully into offline real world. It's also to adapting to the new normality, I suppose. So before I introduce the speaker today, I would like to give some background of today's events. Today's talk actually is scheduled as part of a project entitled Performing Literature and Culture, the Humanities in a Global Context. The project is funded by Nobel laureate in literature and Regents Honorary Fellow Mo Yan. It's a joint project between Beijing Normal University, where Mo Yan is based at, and Regent Park College of Oxford University. It supports programs such as the annual Creative Writing Award, which we just launched last year. Also host writers in residence and organize seminars, lectures that will explore translation in the context of global literature. So now I'm very delighted to introduce our speaker today, Professor Carlos Rojas. Professor Rojas is a professor of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at Trinity College of Arts and Science of Duke University. Previously, he was assistant professor of modern Chinese literature and film at University of Florida. He received a PhD from Columbia University in 2000, and he's a culture historian and understand his research and teaching primarily focus on gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, and the arts of moving image. Professor Rojas is the author of 3 books, I believe, from information I searched from Wikipedia. They are The Naked Gaze, a reflection of Chinese modernity, The Great War, a cultural history, and homesickness, culture, contagion, and national transformation. Besides as an author, he's also known as the translator of Chinese literature fictions, including bestseller author's book Yu Hua's Brothers, which was co-translated with Professor Eileen Chu, and shortlisted for the 2008 Man Asian Literature Prize. Carlos also translated several books by Chinese novelist and short story writer Yan Lianke. His translation of Yan Lianke's The 4 Books was shortlisted for the 2016 Man Booker International Prize. Without further ado, Carlos, I think now I leave the floor. I pass the floor to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Professor Wang, for this introduction and also for inviting me, hosting me. Let me share my screen. There, you can see it, right?
Yes, we can see it, yeah.
Cool. So, great, it's, again, thank you again for having me. Ideally, I'd love to be there in person, but, or to return in person, but this is where we are now at this stage. But I do see a number of friends and colleagues on the list. So thank you for coming out. Let's get started. So I'd like to start with my title. So Words Bridge Cross Borders. The title is might appear a little odd, and it's in fact an artifact of translation. So I'd like to start by saying a few words about the origins of the title as a way of introducing some of the topics I'd like to discuss today. When I was first approached to give this lecture, it was by a Chinese speaker, not Professor Wang. And although the initial email I received was mostly in Chinese, it did include 3 potential talk topics that were given in English. And I indicated that I'd be happy to give the talk, and that the first topic was the one that I felt most sort of comfortable with. But then didn't think about it any further until a few weeks ago. I got the announcement of the flyer for the talk. I realized that the topic was actually being used as the title of the talk. And at the time I thought about changing it or revising it, but then I figured, no, this is actually kind of nice. This is kind of interesting. So so this is something that makes perfect sense, right? Words bridge cross borders. It's a little redundant. I mean, I think if I were to make the title, I would have said either words cross borders or words bridge borders. I mean, you have the two verbs side by side that have similar meaning, but not exactly the same meaning. So it's a little bit odd. So I find it interesting that the title itself seems to have been derived out of a sort of a translation process and continues to bear the marks of that translation, even in the target language, in the English. So what I like about it is that it enacts a performative contradiction, and that the title communicates a sense of translation is possible, that it can bridge borders or cross borders, even as the title itself illustrates the inherent limits of translation. The title draws attention to the underlying translation process that presumably produced it, even as it effectively communicates its intended meaning. So I'd like to begin my remarks by considering a passage from a novel about language and translation that does something quite similar, similar to what the title of the talk is doing. The novel is by the Chinese author and filmmaker Guo Xiaolu, who, there we go. You can still see that clearly, right? Yeah. Who was born in 1973 in China, grew up in China, and then moved to London in 2002. She had already written a couple of books in Chinese and directed several films in Chinese before coming to London. But after relocating to Britain, she decided to start writing in English to capitalize on her local audience there. Her first English language novel, a Chinese English dictionary for lovers, was published in 2007 and describes a young woman named Zhuang, who, like Guo herself, comes to Britain from China. Zhuang, or Z as she comes to be known in the novel, knows very little English when she arrives in London, but nevertheless begins keeping a journal in English detailing her experiences. The journal's early entries are written in broken English that, while perfectly intelligible, nevertheless read as though they have been painstakingly composed by someone relying heavily on a dictionary. And then the entire novel consists of these journal entries that she composes during the year that she is in London before returning back to China. The novel, as its title suggests, is modeled on a dictionary structure and is interspersed with a series of dictionary definitions. And these embedded definitions are included in the novel, though they're taken from an English dictionary and not a Chinese English dictionary, as the novel's title implies that Z is using, as one would typically expect of a novice language learner in her position. And by the way, if you could turn off the beeping on Zoom so it's not beeping every time that someone logs in, that'd be great. The following passage from near the beginning of the novel illustrates both the work's reliance on dictionaries as a structuring device, as well as the deliberately ungrammatical quality of the early portion of the novel. So I have this is an excerpt from near the beginning of the novel. Alien, adjective, foreign, repugnant, 2, from another world, foreigner, being from another world. Alien is unbelievable. I arriving London, Heathrow Airport. Every single name very difficult remembering because just not London Airport. Simple way, like we simple way call Beijing Airport. Everything very confused way here. Passengers is separating into queues. Sign in front of queue, say alien, non-alien. I am alien, like Hollywood film Alien. I live in another planet with funny looking and strange language. I standing in most longly and slowly queue with all aliens waiting for visa checking. I feel little criminal, but I doing nothing so far. My English so bad, how to do? In my textbook, I study back China. It says, English peoples talk like this. How are you? I am very well. How are you? I am very well. Question answer exactly the same. Old saying in China, birds have their bird language, beasts have their beast language. English, they totally another species. Immigration officer holding my passport behind his counter, my heart hanging on high sky. Finally, he's stamping my visa, my heart touching down like airplane. Ah, wo, ho, ha. Picking up my luggage, now I, a legal foreigner. Because legal foreigner from communism region, I must re-educate, must match this capitalism, freedom, and Western democracy. All I know is I'm not understanding what people say to me. From now on, I go with concise Chinese English dictionary at all times. It is red cover, look like little red book. I carrying important book, even go to the toilet in case not knowing the words for some advanced machine and need checking out in dictionary. Dictionary is most important thing from China, concise meaning simple and clean. So it's actually fairly hard to read, at least the beginning. So this excerpt begins with a dictionary definition of the word alien and concludes with a brief discussion of dictionaries, and specifically the concise Chinese English dictionary from which the novel takes its title. First published in 1986 by Beijing Commercial Press and Hong Kong's Oxford University Press. Let me. There we go. The concise Chinese English Chinese dictionary, which is what I believe that the novel is referring to here, although it was probably a later edition, was something of a Bible for my generation of Chinese learners. Published with a red faux leather cover and a distinctive elongated shape, these dictionaries fit easily into a pocket and could be pulled out at a moment's notice. I myself went through several copies when I started studying Chinese, using each copy until it was literally in threads, and at which point I would switch it out for a new one. I no longer have any copies of my early dictionaries, but this is approximately what they look like, and they're kind of seared into my memory. I use them so much. As its title suggests, the concise Chinese English Chinese dictionary was most useful for providing the most common translations of the most commonly used words in either language. If you're looking for nuance or complexity, this was not the place you would want to go. But if you're looking for the linguistic equivalent of the first draft of history written in real time, it was extraordinarily useful. It was like using Google Translate, but without the syntactic component. Limited and flawed, but enough and more than enough to help the beginning language learner gain a toehold in the new language. As the passage from Xiaolu Guo's novel suggests, meanwhile, the size and color of the iconic Chinese English dictionary, or the iconic Chinese English Chinese dictionary, invoked comparisons with another quote unquote little red book, namely the select quotations of Chairman Mao, most commonly known in English as Mao's Little Red Book. So this is a picture of that. There we go. First published in 1964 by the People's Liberation Army, or the earliest version published in 1964. This Little Red Book contained 267 aphorisms that Chairman Mao Zedong's lieutenant, Lin Biao, had selected from Chairman Mao's speeches and essays, including well-known sayings such as, "A revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained, and magnanimous. A revolution is insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. The world is yours as well as ours, but in the last analysis, it is yours. You young people full of vigor and vitality are in the bloom of youth, bloom of life, like the sun at 8 or 9 in the morning. Our hope is placed on you. The world belongs to you. China's future belongs to you. And then one more example. The people and the people alone are the motive force in the making of world history. So I assume that most or all of you are very familiar with modern China, and these quotes, both in English and Chinese, are probably seared into your brain at this point. And many others like them from the Little Red Book. During the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 76, more than 1 billion copies of the Mao's Little Red Book were officially printed, and virtually everyone in China was encouraged to own at least one copy. They were encouraged to read and study it daily, and even carry it around the way an elementary language learner might carry around a pocket dictionary. People were also expected to incorporate quotes from the volume into their everyday conversation as a way of burnishing their political bona fides. These two Little Red Books, that's to say the concise Chinese, English Chinese dictionary and Mao's selected quotations, reflect two different dimensions of language learning, translation, and language use, or of translation, language learning, and language use. The dictionary reflects the importance of mastering basic vocabulary, including words that can be used in a variety of different ways. The Book of Mao Quotations, meanwhile, reflects the importance of mastering phrases that can be used in a variety of different contexts. Although from a linguistic perspective, the Book of Mao Quotations might appear to be as anomalous as the pocket dictionary is conventional, in reality, it similarly captures a fundamental dimension of language use. That is to say, the same way that we constantly take words that we have heard in one context and reapply them to fit new situations, we similarly are constantly taking phrases that we've first learned in one context and reuse them in other contexts, some of which might vary dramatically from the original context. And while it's true that the Book of Mao Quotes was specifically designed to promote a specific ideology, and that the books were published during one of the most ideologically charged periods in modern Chinese history, the quotes themselves quickly became woven into the fabric of everyday life. Commentators often cite examples of this process, such as how a customer at the time might enter a store, a meat shop, and say something like, "Serve the people. Comrade, could I have 2 pounds of pork?" And then the store clerk would then provide the pork and reply, "A revolution is not a dinner party. That will be 1.85 yuan," or similar examples. During the post-Cultural Revolution period, meanwhile, this sort of Mao speak was often used for humorous and ironic effect, as people would often take Mao quotes out of their original context and deliberately place them into new and seemingly anomalous contexts. The way that Mao's quotes were used in the Cultural Revolution and afterwards mirrors an important facet of language use. During the pre-modern period, for instance, Chinese, and particularly literati and officials, were encouraged to commit significant portions of canonical texts to memory, including, but not limited to, the Confucian classics. In fact, many of the 4-character aphorisms, or chengyu, that are used in modern Chinese, almost like ordinary vocabulary, are derived from these sorts of canonical texts. But they are frequently used in what might appear to be completely non-ideological contexts. There are also many examples of the inverse sort of this process, wherein rather than taking phrases associated with ideological texts and redeploying them in an everyday context, such as we were just discussing with Mao's Little Red Book, we instead find cases where phrases originate in what might appear to be non-ideological contexts and then are redeployed in more ideological ways. Perhaps the best example of this latter phenomenon can be found in the history of one of China's so-called 4 books and 5 classics, Si Shu Wu Jing, and this is the Book of Odes, the Shi Jing. Allegedly compiled by Confucius in the 6th century BCE from a collection of folk songs that date back to as early as 1000 BCE, the Book of Odes has come down to us in the form of a collection of 300 odes or poems. And although on the surface, many of these poems might appear to be about completely mundane topics, such as love songs. Over the centuries, however, in order to explain and justify Confucius's selection of these particular poems, an elaborate system of allegorical commentary has developed around the text, such that the poems that appear to be, say, ordinary love ballads are instead read allegorically as having elaborate political and ideological significance. Perhaps the most telling example of this process of taking something that on the surface seems to be non-ideological and granting it an allegorical and ideological meaning can be found in the text that is most commonly associated with Confucius's name, the Analects, 论语. One of the so-called 5 classics, 五经. The Analects is a collection of aphorisms, dialogues, and short vignettes that ostensibly contain the core elements of Confucius's thought. The text contains several allusions to and quotes from the Book of Odes, the most famous of which is a passage that explicitly speaks to the significance of the Book of Odes. And this is a very well-known passage. 是300一言以蔽之乐四无邪. And this can be translated in different ways. One standard translation would be, the odes are 300 in number. They can be summed up in one phrase: thought swerving not from the right path, or thought not swerving from the right path. This line, and particularly the 四无邪, thought not swerving phrase, justifying the practice of quoting the Book of Odes has itself been quoted countless times in a wide variety of contexts. What is perhaps not as commonly recognized, however, is that the phrase in question is itself a quote. And more specifically, it's a quote from the Book of Odes itself. Moreover, the phrase that the Analects takes from the Book of Odes is not only a quote, but more importantly, it clearly appears to be a misquote. Or at least it's a misquote if we rely on the way that later critics have traditionally interpreted the significance of the phrase from the Analects itself. More specifically, the 四无邪 phrase originally appears in a poem from the Book of Odes that seems to have nothing to do with poetry. And instead, it's about horses. So this is, So this is the stanza from a longer poem from which the phrase that Confucius is quoting originally appears in the Book of Odes. It starts out 中中母马, 在中之野, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are different ways of translating this. One translation might be stout and strong are stallions in the paddock meadows. Look what strong ones, gray and white, ruddy and white, white shank, walleye, powerful horses for the chariot. Oh, without slip, may the horses sire. And while there, as with a lot of the poems in the Book of Odes, there are different ways of that one could translate the stanza and the poem as a whole. What is unambiguous, what is not ambiguous at all, is that the character 思 in the phrase 思无邪 in the final line definitely does not mean thought. As in 思想的思, which is the character's default meaning in modern Chinese, and also the way that the Analects line is often interpreted by later critics. So later critics typically interpret, as from what I can tell, 四无邪, the sort of iconic phrase from the Analects, from Confucius' The Analects, as meaning something along the lines of thought not swerving, right? That you have an object, and then which is thought, or something along those lines, and then 无邪 is modifying that. But then, as we see from the original poem, the phrase and context means something completely different, right? Because in the original poem, the si is used not to mean thought, but rather it's an apostrophe, a word without any semantic meaning, which is used here merely for rhetorical emphasis. And this was much more common in the Chinese that was used in this period. Embedded at the heart of this hyper-canonical phrase about the utility of quoting from the Book of Odes, accordingly, is a striking example of a practice of misquotation, of a phrase being taken out of its original context and placed in a new one with a new significance or even a new meaning. And Hans Saussy argues that this is actually a dominant way in which the Book of Odes was used throughout history, that that this process of allegoresis or allegorical readings of the Book of Odes and of transposing, you know, the original poems into new sort of explicitly ideological, historical, and politicized contexts is sort of a dominant way in which the text has been used. And even the early 20th century move to retrieve the original meanings, right? To sort of strip away this these multiple layers of ideological allegoresis and to retrieve the original, more mundane, wholesome, sort of pure meanings of the poems, arguing that that itself was an ideologically motivated gesture that was tied in with the larger sort of political agenda of the May 4th period. So anyway, so quoting as misquoting, citation as miscitation, I would argue is kind of a metaphor for a broader process of translation as mistranslation, and language use as sort of misuse of language. The preceding two examples might appear to go in opposite directions. On one hand, Lin Biao selected 267 passages from Chairman Mao's political writings, and then those quotes eventually became integrated into everyday speech. Serve the people, can you sell me some pork? On the other hand, Confucius allegedly selected 300 poems from a much larger set of popular folk songs, and thereby initiated a process whereby the songs about ordinary topics came to be invested with extraordinary ideological significance. In both cases, however, there is a process whereby existing phrases are granted new meaning as they're transposed from one context to another. And although we view translation as involving an attempt to preserve as much as possible to preserve as much meaning as possible when moving between one language and another, as in the case with language learners using the concise Chinese-English, English-Chinese dictionary, these latter phenomena instead can be viewed as a form of internal translation or anti-translation, which generates differences within the same language itself. So we find another example of this latter sort of what I'm calling internal translation or anti-translation, this marking of difference within Xiao Lu Guo's novel, A Concise Chinese-English Dictionary for Lovers itself. As I mentioned, the novel consists of a journal that the Chinese protagonist, Zi, starts writing in English upon first arriving in London from China. At the time she arrives, her English, as we were discussing, is very rudimentary, and her journal entries are therefore riddled with errors. Over time, however, her English improves, as does the linguistic quality of her journal entries, to the point that by the end of the novel, her writing is actually quite eloquent, such as in the following passage from the very end of the work, written just after the protagonist has returned to China after having spent a year in London. And in this passage, she's responding to a letter that her English boyfriend that she met while in England has written her. Your words are soaked in your great peace and happiness, and these words are being stored in my memory. I kiss this letter. I bury my face in the paper, a sheet torn from some exercise book. I try to smell that faraway valley. I picture you standing in your fields, the mountain behind you, and the sound of the sea coming and going. It is such a great picture you describe. It is the best gift you ever gave me. The address on the envelope is familiar. It must be in West Wales. Yes, we went there together. I remember how it rained. The rain was ceaseless, covering the whole forest, the whole mountain, and the whole land. Nice, right? Although now separated from her English boyfriend, Z has internalized not only her memory of him, but also the English language that he helped her to learn. At the end of the novel, as the end of the novel emphasizes, Z has internalized this language and it has simultaneously transformed her. As important as the actual content of Z's journal entries throughout the novel are, equally important is the transformation that we observe in the language in which they are written. Language in the novel is not merely a means of telling a story, it is the story. The protagonist's growing fluency in the English language is visible in her journal entries, and it tracks the transformations that she undergoes while living abroad. Notably, however, despite the fact that Xiaolu Guo's novel has been translated into Chinese at least 2 separate times, once for the mainland Chinese market and the second time for the Taiwan and overseas Chinese market, neither translation makes any attempt to preserve the dramatic transformation that the protagonist's language undergoes from the beginning of the novel to the end. Instead, both Chinese translations render all the journal entries into standard Chinese, grammatically correct Chinese, completely obscuring the protagonist's linguistic struggle, which is so evident in the original English version of the novel. While translation from one language to another is inherently difficult in its own right, what is even more difficult is to translate the gaps that exist within the language or languages of the source text itself. In the case of Xiaolu Guo's A Chinese-English Dictionary for Lovers, the surface meaning of the journal entries, even those written in broken English, is relatively clear and for the most part can be translated into Chinese or another language without extraordinary difficulty, or at least with no more difficulty than one would encounter in translating the surface meaning of a comparable text. However, what is much more difficult to capture and translate is the ways that the author deliberately distorts the English language in order to mimic the protagonist's own struggles to express herself in a language that she initially barely knows, together with the way that her mastery of the English language is radically transformed over the course of the novel. There are ways in which these linguistic characteristics could be approximated in a Chinese version of the text, but doing so would be considerably more difficult than merely translating the surface meaning of the text. So I don't know if any of you in the audience are interested in English-Chinese translation, but if you are, this might be a kind of an interesting challenge for you, or an interesting project would be to do yet another translation of A Concise Chinese-English Dictionary for Lovers, but one that replicates within the Chinese this linguistic struggle that is such a central component of the original English text. A well-known example of this challenge of translating the gaps that exist within the language of the source text itself can be found in Lu Xun's 1918 short story, Diary of a Madman. Celebrated as the father of modern Chinese literature, Lu Xun is often credited with having played a crucial role in spearheading the transition in the early 20th century from a reliance on different forms of literary Chinese for most forms of writing, to instead using a new form of written vernacular that more closely approximates the language that people used in everyday speech. So as most of you know, up till that point, most writing was in a form of more stylized Chinese that diverged significantly from the kind of language that people used in ordinary conversation. Lu Xun's Diary of a Madman, written and published in 1918, is often credited as being the first modern Chinese short story written in vernacular Chinese. That's not technically accurate, but the story is certainly the most famous early example of a work written in the modern vernacular. So the majority of the story, like Guo Xiaolu's, is written in a journal form, a diary form, as the title, as the story's title implies. And it's written in not only vernacular Chinese, but a very vernacular form of Chinese, right? The famous, this is the first entry, very famous, 今天晚上很好的月光. And the most widely used English translation was by a pair of China-based translators, Yang Xianyi and Gladys Yang, in the 50s. They translated Lu Xun's selected works, including his stories and a number of his other texts. And this is how they rendered it. Tonight, the moon is very bright. I have not seen it for over 30 years. So today, when I see it, I felt in unusually high spirits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the rest of the diary entries are more or less like this. But very famously, before the diary begins, before the first journal entry, there's a preface that appears as a metatextual frame describing the narrator's discovery of the diary, and explaining what he then decided to do with it. But it's obviously also part of the text, part of the fictional work itself. And the language of that preface is written in a very different language from the diary. It's written in not only classical Chinese or literary Chinese, but a very stylized form of literary Chinese that Lu Xun was known for using in that period. 某君苦中经营其名, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'd like to briefly talk about now is how to negotiate the transition from the literary Chinese of the preface that you see here to the very vernacular form of Chinese in which the diaries themselves are written. And in this transition from the highly stylized preface to the very, very vernacular Chinese of the journal is striking today. It would have been even more striking for readers at the time, given that it was very, very unusual to see a literary work written in that kind of vernacular Chinese in the first place. So it was sort of like a gut punch when you got to it. And so that transition, that linguistic transition is a key element of the story, much like the development and the transformation of Zi's language, English, in Guo Xiaolu's novel is an intrinsic and integral part of that novel as well. So let's look at a couple of translations of this opening preface. This is by the Yangs, Yang Xianyi and Gladys Yang, two brothers whose names I need not mention here were both good friends of mine in high school, but after a separation of many years, we gradually lost touch. I happened to hear that one of them was seriously ill, and since I was going back to my old home, I broke my journey to call on them. I saw only one, however, who told me that the invalid was his younger brother. I appreciate your coming such a long way to see us, he said, but my brother recovered some time ago and has gone elsewhere to take up official work, a post. So this is fine, but the language, the English, is really not markedly different from that of the journal itself. It reads as, you know, a fairly sort of everyday English. And so when you're reading this, you go from this preface to the first journal entry, the language becomes a little more sort of succinct, a little more blunt, but it's not unusually so. I have not seen it for over 30 years. So today when I saw it, I felt in unusually high spirits. That is a similar kind of linguistic register as the preface in the English translation. More recently, Julia Lavelle was hired by Penguin to do a retranslation of Lu Xun's stories, of its complete fiction for the Penguin Classic series, and this being the first Chinese author to be featured in the Penguin Classics series. So this was quite an opportunity, quite a benefit to the field. Interestingly, though, in her translation of Lu Xun's Diary of a Madman, she does the same thing essentially, right? She revises and updates the Yang and Yang translation, But it's still more or less in the same linguistic register as the short story itself. This is her rendering of the preface. At school, I had been close friends with two brothers whose names I omit to mention here. As years went by after we graduated, however, we gradually lost touch. Not long ago, I happened to hear that one of them had been seriously ill while on a visit home. I broke my journey to call on them. I found only one of them at home, and he told me that it was his younger brother who had been afflicted. Thanking me for my concerns, he informed me that his brother had long since made a full recovery and had left home to wait for an appropriate official post to fall vacant, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So both Yang and Yang and Julia Lovell, I would argue, are doing something similar with the Lu Xun text that the Chinese translators of Xiaolu Guo of Guo Xiaolu did with her English novel, right? In that they very they translate the meaning of the text, but they don't really make that much of an effort to or that much of a discernible effort to retain the linguistic quality of the language itself. So one translator who did attempt to do that is former Chinese literature professor at Stanford, William Lyle, who in 1990 published his own translation of the stories. And his approach is quite different. This is his rendering of the preface. There was once a pair of male siblings whose actual names I beg your indulgence to withhold. Suffice it to say that we three were boon companions during our school years. Subsequently, circumstances contrived to rend us asunder so that we were actually bereft of knowledge regarding each other's activities. Not too long ago, however, I chanced to hear that one of them had been hard afflicted with a dread disease. I obtained this intelligence at a time when I happened to be returning to my native haunts, and hence made so bold as to detour somewhat from my normal course in order to visit them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see that he's using a sort of a deliberately, quasi-archaic, or at least kind of more literary form of English that then differs quite dramatically from the sort of emphatically colloquial quality of the short story of the journal entries. And this is his rendering of the first journal entries. Moonlight's really nice tonight. Haven't seen it in 30 years. Seeing it today, I feel like a new man. I know now that I've been completely out of things for the past 3 decades or more, but I've still got to be very careful. Otherwise, how do you explain those dirty looks that the Zhao family's dog gave me? I've got good reason for my fear. So the Bill Lyle translation is not perfect. There are some well-known errors, sort of oversights or whatever in this translation. But I do think that it's worth knowing that he's trying to sort of capture the shifts in linguistic register in a way that none of the other sort of major translators of the text or of Lu Xun systematically try to do, or of Lu Xun's short stories systematically try to do. I'm sort of approaching the end of my time, so just very briefly, another example of this kind of phenomenon can be found in Yan Lianke's novel, 2004 novel, Linen's Kisses. The Chinese novel, the title is Shou Huo, translated as Linen's Kisses. This is, I've translated several of Yan Lianke's novels, as Professor Wang mentioned, and this is the first one that I translated. So Yan Lianke is from Henan. He speaks Mandarin with a fairly heavy sort of regional accent, and all of his writings, to varying extents, draw on sort of what you could call local dialect, local sort of terms that are particularly common in that area, that region, but are not necessarily used in sort of standard Mandarin. What is interesting about this particular novel, though, is that he explicitly marks a lot of those instances of the use of local dialect or local vernacular and then defines the words, right? So this is the very first sentence, the very first paragraph of the novel. And you can see that there's a one in the second clause or the second phrase. 人本就是寿火. And then at the end of the chapter, well, that's my translation. Well, look in the middle of the sweltering summer when people couldn't liven. I translate 寿火 there as liven. And then at the end of the chapter, he has a series of 序言, where he defines or explains words, phrases, or passages in the text. And the first word that he explains, the very first footnote or endnote in the novel, is of the phrase 寿火, where he explains that it's a 北京方言, or 北方方言. This is my translation. To liven, dialect used mostly in Western Henan and Eastern Henan's Balo Mountains. The term means enjoyment, happiness, passion, and also carries connotations of finding pleasure in discomfort and making pleasure out of discomfort. And then what's interesting about the novel is that the entire novel has these series of endnotes or 序言 that are used not only to explain language, but also to give a lot of historical background to the main text, which is set in the year 1998, 1999. So it's a very contemporary setting, but then the historical background goes back centuries. And then these endnotes some of them are quite lengthy, to the point that approximately half or even more than half of the novel, of the text of the novel, appears in the footnotes rather than in the main text. But what I find interesting about the novel is that it's deliberately using these various fangyan, these various dialect terms and phrases, but is marking them as relatively unknown and needing to be explained. So it's basically assuming, even in the Chinese, it's assuming that the reader doesn't fully understand the Chinese and that the language needs to be explained to them. And so in rendering the English, I thought it was important to try to preserve that foreignness of the dialect phrases. So sometimes 寿火, the title, is rendered as enjoyment in English. And before my translation came out, that's the way that people usually translate the title, which doesn't make sense to me because, or it doesn't seem right to me, because enjoyment is a perfectly ordinary phrase or ordinary term in English. And so then you get to the first line in the novel, you have the word enjoyment. If you use enjoyment to translate 寿火, and then you have the footnote explaining enjoyment means this, and it doesn't really make sense, because it's like, why are you telling me what enjoyment means? I know what enjoyment means. So I thought it was important to come up with words that are sort of seemingly recognizable in English, but are preserve that sort of element of difference, the same way that 寿火, contains two common characters in Chinese, but it's a binom that many people from outside the region probably have not encountered before. So I have one final part here, going back to the Xiaolu Guo's. Well, yeah, let me just spend 1 or 2 minutes talking about this. So in the passage I quoted from her novel at the beginning of my talk, she also mentions this old saying in Chinese: birds have their bird language, beasts have their beast language. English, they totally another species. Legend has it that Chinese writing developed out of an act of radical translation. A version of this legend can be found in the postface to one of China's earliest dictionaries, the Shuowen Jiezi. Explanation of simple and compound characters composed around 100 CE. The postface opens with a description of how abstract patterns on the plumage of birds and the pelts of animals, together with the tracks left by the feet of birds and animals, provide the inspiration for both the Chinese divinatory hexagrams found in the Book of Changes, as well as Chinese writing itself. So it's arguing, in this early dictionary, arguing that Chinese characters derived from patterns found in nature that then were transformed into written Chinese characters. This claim that hexagrams and Chinese characters were derived from abstract patterns found in nature, meanwhile, implies that the relationship between form and meaning is inherently contingent, with linguistic meaning having been grafted onto a non-linguistic graphic system. This account, in other words, positions the birth of Chinese writing system within a process of translation from meaninglessness into meaning. The notion that Chinese writing emerged from a process of translation is crystallized by the fact that in the preceding discussion, the same character, Wen, is used to refer both to actual Chinese characters as well as to abstract patterns on bird plumage and animal pelts that help to inspire them. In fact, the title of this Shuowen itself, which could be translated as explaining writing patterns, concisely captures this notion of grafting linguistic meaning onto abstract form. This attention to the historicity of the Chinese writing system is also one of the driving inspirations behind the dictionary itself. Xu Shun compiled the dictionary in response to the rediscovery of a set of Chinese texts written in a variety of different scripts, including the antiquated seal script. To facilitate the study of these texts, Xu Shun developed a lexicon of seal script characters in which they were composed. He identified several discrete operations that may link a written character to its assigned meaning, noting that a character may bear a pictographic resemblance to its referent, may contain a semantic element specifying the meaning of its referent. It may feature a phonetic element indicating the pronunciation of the corresponding word. And in some cases, a single character may feature two or more of these different elements that granted its meaning. By focusing on ancient seal script, Xu Shun was able to identify many etymological elements of the characters that were no longer visible in standardized versions in use at the time that he was writing, around 100 CE. A good example of the Shuowen's, and this is my final conclusion, a good example of the Shuowen's approach can be found in its entry for the character of writing itself, Wen. Xu Shun observes that the character Wen consists of a set of intersecting lines and notes that it resembles an abstract pattern, Wen, and concludes by specifying that all compound characters semantically related to the notion of writing pattern are derived from a Wen graph. So this is the Wen 做花也上交文 繁文之属皆从文. The character Wen consists of intersecting lines and resembles an intersecting pattern Wen. All the characters relating to writing patterns Wen are derived from a Wen graph. So what's interesting here is that in defining Wen, it uses the same character 3 times, but each time it's using it in a slightly different way, or actually in a significantly different way. And just include, when at first glance, this short entry might well appear to be rather tautological. Wen resembles Wen, and all Wen are derived from Wen. Its significance actually lies in the gaps between these different understandings of Wen. In particular, the Wen graph is used in a different way in each of the 4 times that it appears in the entry, being cited first for its pictorial value, then in the narrow sense of an abstract pattern, then in the broader meaning of pattern or writing, and finally as a lexical component found in other characters. The entry accordingly is located within a translational process space between Wen as pattern and Wen as writing. So I'll conclude here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rojas, for your very rich sharing of the examples. Now we have a few minutes. May I, leave open the floor or questions to the audience? So feel free to ask questions or raise your hands. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you can ask directly if you have a question. My colleague Louis Gordon, you can unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you so much, Professor, for such an education, and for me particularly so, is I don't have Chinese, unlike many of the people who may have much more literary and educated questions to ask you. You spoke really eloquently about the gaps that you have to fill in and how much creativity there is. So I'm wondering how you approach when you are working with an author who is living and who you can ask for information about. Do you actively seek more clarification? How does this dialogue happen? Thank you.
No, that's a good question. Just to briefly go back to your first sort of remark, just to I guess my thesis, my point is I'm not concerned really with trying to fill in gaps, but rather to preserve the gaps, right? I'm interested in those gaps that exist within the source text itself, and rather than trying to fill them in, I should find some way of keeping those gaps in the translation, and then by extension, maybe the second order sort of gap would be the gap between the source text and the target text, which presumably you're trying to bridge, right? Words bridge cross borders, but also sort of marking that process of translation. So in response to your question, yeah, this is I mean, most of the stuff that I translate is by living authors, all of whom I'm sort of in dialogue with all of them at some level. I mean, I anecdotally, I remember hearing about one author, not someone I was working with, who sort of was displeased with a translator, and I think severed ties with them subsequently because the translator didn't ask them what they meant, right? So which I found kind of amusing. My own process is one where I do the translation essentially in its entirety, and then at the end of the day, if I still have some questions, and then we'll approach the author about that. Often the questions are not, I mean, sometimes they're at the level, address surface meaning, but what often generates more interesting discussions are questions that I get from my editors, my English editors, who usually don't know Chinese. They're just editing on the basis of the English, and then they have questions about sort of continuity issues or sort of various different elements of the novel that often are not strictly translation questions, but speak to issues within the original novel itself. And my author Yan Ke is always fairly interested and amused by those sorts of questions that he gets, because he doesn't really get that kind of editorial feedback for the Chinese versions. So that's, I usually have that kind of back and forth at the end of the process, but I never finish chapter 2 and then say, oh, here in chapter 2 I have these 5 questions, can you help me out with that?
Thank you so much.
Margaret had a question. Professor Margaret Hallenbrand. Please.
Hi, Carlos.
Hi, Margaret. Good to see you. Good to hear you.
That was really, really interesting. I really like what you said about the parallels between the translations of the preface of Lu Xun's Diary of a Madman and Guo Xiaolu. That I think it's always really aggravated me that translators of Madman have made so little attempt to try and navigate what is, as you said, the gut punch of the text is that shift from one linguistic register to another. I just wonder to what extent you think it might be to do with, well, you mentioned editors, to do with publishing pressures, when there's always such this inherent bias against any kind of what Schleiermacher called foreignization already baked in. Could that be partly why in the case of Guo Xiaolu's translations into the Taiwanese and mainland market, is that part of the reason why we see this? Is that part of the reason why we see it even now with Julia Lovell's Penguin translation, that there just isn't the appetite for that level of foreignization remaining within the translation?
I don't know. I mean, it seems like a lot of these translations, the appetite for the translations is because at some level they're foreignized, right? I mean, to the extent that Chinese literature sells in the international market, for the most part, it's because it's marking itself as Chinese, right? I mean, you don't, I mean, I guess there's some authors that, have a phenomenon sort of like Murakami, where you read it and you kind of forget that it's in translation. You kind of imagine that he's writing in English. There's a young author that Shuang Xuetao, whose work I think somewhat resembles Murakami's, that the translations read very, very smoothly. Anyways, but for the most part, I mean, very few people read Yan Ke because they want to imagine that he's writing in English, right? So And similarly, at this point, I don't think people read Lu Xun because they want to imagine that he's like a Chinese Walter Benjamin or something like that. Although he could be. But I think I think you are right that there might be kind of a perception of the limits of how much foreignization the market would tolerate, right? And an attempt to sort of want to meet sort of non-Chinese readers at least halfway. But maybe as I said, it works in both directions, right? The both translators of the Guo Xiaolu also sort of not being willing to unpack the Chinese language in the same way that she's doing with the English language. And I kind of understand, I guess, because if you're a translator, you don't want to produce something that is completely ungrammatical, but that's the whole point of the novel, right?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And actually, I got a question, if I may ask it well, Carlos, is, I mean, both Margaret and Louise, they mentioned about, how do you generate from experience of, either you choose to fill in the gap or not filling the gap. If you translate literally from one language to another language, I mean, one need to provide some full meanings of those to those new audience whose culture, background, or life experience often might be quite different from original writers' social, political, or culture context. I mean, that's kind of like a if you say words bridge cross borders, the border there sometimes could be conflicts of acceptance or feel comfortable about the text, especially for the new audience. I kind of remember I read a preface by Yu Hua on his book, The Blood Merchant. He kind of mentioned that I give up my dialect and to embrace those the new Mandarin language to make my words to be to be accepted by the readers, and it's kind of an invasion of another language. So I suppose for my question would be probably a borrowing one, repeating one is, how do you keep this subtle balance though of respect to the original author's context, also adapt to the audience with their acceptance and feeling comfortable for the reading experience, especially here. Probably asking, especially here, there's beyond the level of the linguistic quality, or more on the values, let's say, of different forms of societies. I mean, this is could become quite subtle for either maintaining the relationship with the also original country where the book from, and also the new markets, really. Thank you.
Yeah, no, these are great questions. And they're obviously sort of come up anytime that you're doing this sort of translation. And there are ones that in my discussions with my editors, my English editors, I mean, that's often what we end up focusing most on. And I just a few sort of thoughts or responses. So I when I'm translating modern fiction, I never add footnotes. I mean, like with something like Linen's Kisses, the original text has footnotes, and so I kept those footnotes, but they're the author's footnotes. So I would never add, or at least I never have up to this point, added footnotes of my own explaining things, because it seems to me that sort of rips the novel out of its original. I mean, it makes it sort of a more scholarly sort of reading experience that is different from the way that it would have originally been received. Sometimes I do kind of very subtly insert kind of a partial explanation of something if I think that it's not entirely, if it's a concept or a term or whatever that English readers won't necessarily be familiar with. But I'm also kind of careful about how to do that. Like just one example that came up in a novel that I've recently finished, that I recently sort of went through the editorial process on, is that there are references to qi, right? Like a qigong de qi, and my my editors asked, well, can you give a kind of an explanation of what this is? And my response was, it would be very odd, right? Because I mean, it's such a basic concept in Chinese that in the original novel, you would never have an explanation of what qi is, right? Because you sort of know. And also it's something that's actually been incorporated into the English language. I mean, the OED actually had it as a word of the year back in the 1990s, right? So it's something that you definitely have in particularly sort of new age sort of English language discussions. But conversely, another word that appears in the novel very frequently, shifu, right? Which doesn't have a really good English equivalent, so I can't translate it directly, right? But for that, I thought I sort of subtly sort of added a sort of her mentor or shifu or something like that. So the first time I used it, I gave a little bit of explanation. The nice thing about I mean, I've translated a number of different authors, but I've definitely spent most time translating Yan Ke, and always with the same editor, well, always with the same press and usually with the same editors. I've switched primary editor once. And so with that, we kind of develop a sort of a standard practice. And each time I do a new novel, we'll when I'm discussing with the editors, they'll say, well, how have you dealt with this issue before? Such as the use of say, words for distance and stuff like that. And then I say, well, I've always, kept the word, the distance words. And he often sort of it goes back and forth between metric and Chinese terms. And I've always kept those original terms. And they're like, okay, we'll do that for this one as well. So I see myself as kind of having like a very small sort of pedagogical role where for certain types of words, I sort of consistently use them in the Chinese or use romanization, and I kind of am hoping my readers will pick them up. I mean, obviously with other languages like Spanish or French, you can do that more, right? Because you can assume a greater sort of familiarity on the part of sort of a typical English language reader. But to a certain extent, you can start doing that with Chinese as well, right? I mean, that they're like shifu, guanxi, stuff like that, right? Are terms that many English language readers will either have run across or would be willing to figure out in context when they run across it. So that goes back to Margaret's question about foreignization, right? That I think that's becoming more possible even for sort of major sort of commercial publishers or works put out by major commercial publishers in English translation.
Brilliant, thank you. I think there's a question from Pamela Hunt from the chat. If you can read there, I don't know, in the chat though.
Yeah. It's not showing up on mine. I think that's sent to you.
Yeah. Let me
I
just
just
read
saw
it
it.
for you.
Okay. Yeah.
Let me read it for you.
Yeah. No, I just saw it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't. May I type my question here? The idea of anti-translation, and wondered if he could place this idea in relation to Emily Apter's work on Against World Literature. I wondered also if his suggestion is that the anti-translated work that travels or crosses borders, and if his suggestion is that it is the anti-translated work that travels or crosses borders in a smoother way. No, that's really interesting. I was using the concept of anti-translation to think about these gaps within a text, right? But I think that the way that that you're taking it, I think is also quite relevant to think about the relationship or the position of any individual text within these larger literary communities, and the idea of them sort of preserving a certain degree of necessary distance from a presumptively sort of universalizing community of world literature. So that I think is not sort of it's an extension of the sort of the more specific point that I was trying to develop within the work. And And I think it also speaks to the question or the issue that Margaret raised in her question, right? Of the role, the status of this foreignization within translation, right? That's works that are circulating in translation, which is for many languages a necessary prerequisite for being incorporated into this kind of framework of world literature, but at the same time marking a partial resistance to that full incorporation.
Brilliant, thank you. I hope Pamela get the answer. I wonder if there's more questions, though. We are slightly running beyond the time we set. Otherwise, I would say thank you very much, Professor Rojas, for joining us. It's such a wonderful talk. I suppose over there, you are still just passing 8, quite early for you to give us this talk this morning. And also I want to give my thanks to all the audience to contribute wonderful questions and keep stimulated discussion. I hope you all a great weekend ahead. So
Great.
Thank you all.
Thank you, and thank everyone. I look forward to seeing some of you in person, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Sure. We would like to see you, come to see you in the near future. Brilliant. Thank you. Have a good day.
Good night.
Bye-bye.